Well, good morning. It's great to see everyone this morning, and certainly especially good to see our visitors. We welcome you to this family here at Lost River. And for those who are joining us on live stream, this is something that sometimes in person we can take for granted, but we are excited that you're still able to join in this way, and we hope that you feel just as much a part of the body that's here this morning. This morning, as has already been mentioned, we are talking about prayer. And as I've done in times past, I took to social media and to other outlets as well. And I just asked this question to whoever would answer. And the question was, based on your experience, how would you finish this sentence? And I want you to think about this question for yourself. Prayer is what? Prayer is what? How would you finish that sentence? And the responses that I got, I found very interesting and helpful and inspiring. Some of the answers: prayer is life-altering. It's life-changing. Prayer is heard. It's powerful. Prayer is an honest conversation. I love that. An honest conversation. Sometimes we're hesitant to say truly what's on our hearts and what we're thinking, but certainly God knows that. And so it is an honest conversation. We certainly see that pouring out through the Psalms, this honest conversation with God. Someone else said, release. Prayer is release. It's the peace that surpasses understanding. Others, intimacy with God. Prayer is a privilege, and maybe that's something that we forget. It's a gift. It's a privilege. God, the creator of the universe, is inviting us into his presence. This is a great privilege. Prayer is different for everyone. And then this one I found to be the most interesting. Prayer is hard. Prayer is hard. Can you relate to that one at all this morning? Prayer is hard. I think it's hard for maybe any number of reasons. I think sometimes prayer is difficult because we lack the focus. Right? There's so many thoughts to think. There's so many things that are distracting us throughout our day that sometimes we find it hard to find time to pray. And when we do pray, our minds are running around, and we're kind of like the dog from Up, where it's like squirrel, and he's just like he's taking off towards it. Our mind just becomes so distracted with all these thoughts that are racing, and it's hard just to pray. And so sometimes it's lack of focus, or maybe it's a lack of understanding. We wonder, okay, what's the purpose of this? How does it work? Why do I pray if God already knows what I need and he already knows what is going to happen in the future? So why pray? Or what am I supposed to say? How am I supposed to say anything that could bend the ear of the almighty creator and maker of heaven and earth? What am I supposed to say in this moment of prayer? But then I also think it's sometimes hard because of a lack of faith. Does God really hear? Does he really care about me and my circumstances? Or if he does care, will he actually do anything about it? Because I prayed for my parents not to get a divorce when I was growing up, but that didn't happen, says perhaps someone. Or I prayed that this depression and anxiety that seems to be crippling my life would depart from me, that God would restore to me the joy and the happiness of living with him and a life lived with him, and yet I still feel like it's lingering in my life, and I don't know what to do. Or I've prayed about this financial situation, and I've tried to do every right thing, and yet here I am still stuck, wondering how I'm going to get my family through this. Or there's this sin and temptation that I have prayed for God to take away time and time and time again, and yet it seems that way of escape is so difficult to find. We pray collectively for churches, for nations, for this world, and all of the brokenness of it. And sometimes it feels as if it's falling on deaf ears. And so, yes, prayer is hard. But if you have felt that way this morning, and certainly I have felt this way, that prayer at times is challenging and it's hard, I want to share a passage this morning that I hope will bring some level of comfort to us and will hopefully perhaps even peel back the curtain behind what happens when we pray. And I want to start with this verse from Paul, where Paul says, "We don't know how to pray." We do not know how to pray, or other versions say we don't know what to pray for. And certainly I think that's a relatable experience for all of us. Prayer's hard because of all the reasons we just mentioned, and because of that, we don't know how to pray. We don't know what to bring to the throne of God. We don't know what to pray for, or how all these situations will be resolved within our own life, within all of the world, or within the entire story of God's redemption as it plays out and unfolds in human history. And so we wonder, what do we pray for? We do not know how to pray. This is the struggle. But what's fascinating to me about those words is not just how perhaps descriptive they are of my own prayer life and prayer experience, and perhaps for you as well, but what fascinates me is who it is who says these words. Paul. Right? Paul, who grew up having memorized the Psalms and had these ancient words ringing in his ears throughout his day and throughout his life, the words of the Psalms ringing in his ears, these great prayer warriors. And it's Paul who was under the instruction and who learned from the spiritual disciplines of like the great rabbi of his day, Gamaliel, who certainly was trained in the art of prayer. And yet he says, we do not know how to pray. Paul, the one who says, who writes all these amazing prayers throughout the New Testament, who encountered Jesus himself, he's the one who says, we do not know how to pray. And I think that should give us some level of comfort that if someone like Paul is saying these words, and perhaps we're not alone. But Paul says, we do not know how to pray, and that is okay. That is okay. And I'm not sure where you're at in your own prayer life this morning, but if you're like me, those are the words that I have needed this week. Because sometimes I hear the prayers of Paul or the prayers of David or Nehemiah or the other great prayer warriors throughout Scripture or different people here at Lost River or in my own life, and I think, man, I wish I could pray like that. But sometimes I get discouraged because it's this struggle of I don't know what to pray for. I don't know how to pray. And prayer can be hard. But Paul says that is okay, and it's okay because of what Paul says happens when you pray. And I believe that to know this is to know the joy and the intimacy and the release and the privilege and the power of prayer. And so this morning, I want us to step back and zoom out and look at the larger picture of what Paul is saying here in Romans 8 as it leads to verse 26. But I want to note one other thing before we jump into the text this morning. There are many different types of prayer throughout the Bible. There are prayers of petition and intercession, of thanksgiving and praise and communion. And certainly those are descriptive of many different prayers that we might pray. But what's interesting is the word that Paul is going to use here is the idea of groaning. If we were to ask Paul, prayer is what, he would say here, prayer is groaning. And I think there's something very relatable to that. Prayer is this groaning. And sometimes maybe we think of groaning as kind of a negative thing, this grumbling or complaining, perhaps that was going on with Israel in the wilderness. But that's not what Paul is is talking about here. This groaning has this dual component to it. On one hand, it's this aching pain at the reality of the way things are, but it's also this excited anticipation of what is to be. And so you have a couple who has been separated for perhaps some length of time, a week or longer, and there's this aching pain because they're not together and they want to be together. But there's also this excited anticipation for when that reunion comes, when they're reunited. So this aching pain, this excited anticipation, or the example that Paul's going to use is of a woman bringing life into the world. This aching pain, but yet this excited anticipation and hope. And this, of all the prayers, all the kinds of prayers throughout the Bible, I think this is descriptive of almost every one. There is this sense of groaning, this sense of aching and anticipation that's at the heart of almost every prayer that we read. And that's how Paul's going to describe it here, this groaning. And so Romans 8 in verse 18, Paul begins with this. He says, "For I consider that the present sufferings of this time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us." All right, so far nothing about prayer just yet, but everything in this section is going to be moving toward verse 26. But he starts by talking about this suffering, and we don't know exactly what Paul has in mind here, but it seems to be just the general suffering that is ever present in our world, the suffering that's a part of the human experience, the trials and the loss and the heartache and the injustices that we see, all of the things that make up the common experience of human suffering in our world today is this idea of suffering that's here. And he says, whatever the sufferings of this present time are, it is not worthy to be compared to the glory of the age to come. And so here we find ourselves in the in-between, between the now and the not yet, between the suffering of this present age and the glory of the age to come, between the way things are and the way that things could be and should be, and Paul says ultimately one day will be. And as we stand in that gap between the way things are and the way that things could be, Paul says this. He says, "For creation eagerly waits with anticipation for the sons of God to be revealed. For creation was subjected to futility." And this phrase, subjected to futility, he'll say it a slightly different way in a verse to come. He describes it as this creation being in bondage to corruption, but it's this idea that creation itself is enslaved and is in need of its own exodus, of its own redemption. And here, Paul is echoing back to Genesis 1 through 3, right? In the beginning, Adam and Eve are set up as the co-rulers of the world, the divine image bearers of God, the stewards over God's good creation. But when Adam and Eve sinned, they brought a curse not just upon humanity, but on all creation itself. In fact, God even says, "Cursed is the ground because of you." And so creation is in this state in which it desperately needs repair and restoration and redemption. And when we look around us, we see the evidence of that, right? We see the brokenness of the world. We see the horrific tragedies of the way things are. And in looking at that, it's almost like we see this once beautiful painting that has been smeared, or this beautiful vase that has been cracked or shattered. And it needs the master artist to come and reshape it and restructure it and bring it back to the way that it's supposed to be. And so creation was subjected to futility. He says, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it. and hope that creation itself will also be set free from its bondage to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together with the labor pains, even until now. All right, so here's the picture. Creation itself was dragged into this bondage of sin and corruption, like the thorns that overtook God's good creation in the garden, and it is in desperate need of repair. And all creation, sun, moon, sea, skies, bird, all of it is crying out to God with this aching pain and this excited anticipation of the glory that is to be revealed, when the sons of God would be revealed. Why? Because when the sons of God are revealed, they're going to do exactly what Adam and Eve were supposed to do all along. Things are going to be made right. Things are going to be set in order. Things are going to be just the way that it's supposed to be. And so here we are in our current reality. We hear the echoes of Eden. We catch these glimpses of a paradise lost, but we know that it's not right. We know that it's not the way that it's supposed to be. And so creation longs for the stewards of God's good creation who will come and rule over the restored world that is good and right and beautiful and just the way that it should be. And so creation groans until now. And then Paul turns to us. He says, not only creation. It's not just creation crying out for this redemption, but he says we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. All right, now, Paul, he weaves so many things together here, but remember where we started. We are living in the in-between, between the now and the not yet, the suffering of the present age and the glory of the age to come. And what Paul describes here is what he describes in other places like 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 22 as God placing within our hearts, giving to us his Spirit as a down payment, a pledge, as a promise of what is to come. And what is to come here is exactly what Paul says, this adoption where we are fully united with the Father. Though we have been adopted, now we seek the full reunion with the Father in perfect unity and the redemption of our whole being, reshaped and renewed in the likeness of his Son. And as we stand and find ourselves in this gap between the now and the not yet, we groan along with all creation for this hope and anticipation of what's to come. And maybe that's not how you have thought about prayer often in the past, but here Paul describes it as the participation in the cry of all creation that ascends to God. And it's like the dissonance between the way things are and the way that things could be and should be and will be strikes a chord so deep within us that we can't help but cry out to God and call on his name with this groaning and this anticipation, calling for God to act. And so we cry along with creation. We groan for the glory of the age to come. For, Paul says, in this hope we were saved. But hope, he says, that is seen is not hope. Because who hopes for what he sees? That wouldn't be hope at all. But he says, now if we hope for what we do not see, if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with patience. And isn't that the experience of prayer? God, I can't see it. God, I'm praying for you to respond and to react in this world. And I'm praying about the situation and calling for you to bring your plan of redemption to its completion, but I don't see all the ways that it's going to work out. I want to participate in your redemptive work in the world, but I don't know my place in it. And I can't see how it's all going to work out. We can't see this hope for which we long. And so we wait. And sometimes that waiting feels like that excited anticipation, and other times it feels like that aching pain. But in that moment, in the groaning, Paul says that in the same way, just as creation groans, just as you and I groan, in the same way, the Spirit also helps us in our weakness, because we do not know how to pray. We do not know how to pray as we should. We do not know what to ask for. We do not know what to pray about. But he says the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings that are too deep for words. Now, I know sometimes when we talk about the Spirit, we can get a little uptight because there is so much mystery, and certainly I don't pretend to know all of how the Spirit works or even exactly what Paul is saying here, but I want for a moment for us to just appreciate how powerful this is. We do not know how to pray. We don't know what to ask for, and we struggle with that. We struggle to see how God's going to work out his plans in our lives and in the world. And that's okay. Because when you pray, when you groan, the Spirit groans with us. The Spirit intercedes for us. And the Spirit not only takes our words and perhaps transforms them into some eloquent words before the throne of God. No, he takes our words and creates a groaning that is too deep for words, beyond words that we could grasp. And if you think that the prayers of Paul or David or Nehemiah are powerful and inspiring, just imagine the prayers that are being lifted up to the throne of God by the intercession of the Spirit. Paul says that's what happens when you pray. As we wait for the hope that we cannot see, the Spirit helps us peer into the darkness and pray God's future into our present reality. Or as Jesus teaches us to pray himself, it's the prayer of thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so finally, Paul says this, and God who searches our hearts. And I love that phrase. So, not very many people search your heart, right? We get to know each other from a distance. We're okay rubbing shoulders. We're okay doing small talk. But it takes a lot to really search someone's heart, to really know the hopes and dreams and aspirations that lie deep within them. And sometimes we don't even want to go there and explore it ourselves. But God searches our hearts. And he knows the mind of the Spirit, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that God works all things together for good for those who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose. In the past, I read this and I thought of this as maybe if my prayer is in God's will, if it aligns just right, then maybe he'll make it happen. But regardless of my prayers, it'll all work out in the end. But I don't think that's what Paul is saying here. Instead, what Paul seems to be saying about our prayers is not despite our prayers, it'll all work out in the end, but precisely that God is using our prayers to work out his end. That as we stand in the gap between the way things are and the way that things could be and should be, the Spirit brings the groanings of our heart to God. And God uses our prayers to bring his redemptive work to completion. And that is what happens when you pray. Or perhaps we could say it this way, that when you pray, God uses the groaning of our hearts to work all things together for good. God uses the groanings of our heart, the groanings that we struggle to express, that are often hard to to even get across and put into words. God uses the groanings of our hearts to work all things together for good. And if you're struggling to really believe that this morning, I want to offer just one story as we close. Because I think what Paul says here is powerful and inspiring, but sometimes Paul, in his powerful and eloquent words, can seem a little distant and abstract from our own experience. And what we find in the Bible story is many, many men and women who stand in that gap. And one of those characters is a woman. And it was a woman who, during a time when the world around her was in ruins, found herself powerless to change it. Her nation was divided by tribalism and injustices, and corruption was rampant throughout the political leaders and rulers of the land, and even the religious rulers, the priests, the ones who were supposed to be the representatives of God himself, the intercessors who stood between God and the people. They were also corrupted by greed and scandals of sexual exploitation. And it was a time in which nothing was the way that it was supposed to be. And perhaps many had lost hope in whatever it could be. And the problems persisted not just in the world around her, but in her own world, in her family, in her marriage, in her life. Because in a world where all of your security and identity and meaning and hope for the future was wrapped up in the raising up of a son, this woman was barren. And in her state of despair, it says that one day she stood up. One day she stood up, and standing in that gap, standing in the gap of aching and anticipation, of heartache and hope, it says that Hannah was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept with many tears. And making a vow, not as a bargain with God, but as a participation in his plans and promises, pleaded, "O Lord of heaven's armies, if you will remember me and give me a son, I will give him back to you, and he will be yours all the days of his life." And it says that the Lord did remember Hannah. And he not only remembered Hannah, but he remembered his people, the cries of the people that were ascending to his throne. And as an answer to Hannah's prayer and to the problems of the people, God, through Hannah, raised up a son, Samuel. And Samuel, it was he who would unite the 12 tribes, who would restore the hope that was at that time lost in Israel, and who would draw the hearts of the people back to God, and who would go on to anoint David, the first of the lineage of kings whose succession would end in the Messiah himself, the hope of the world. And while Hannah never saw those plans unfold before her eyes or in her own lifetime, God used the groaning of her heart to work all things together for good. And so this morning, what is your groaning? Where do you feel the dissonance? Where do you feel that tension between the way things are and the way things could be? When you hear the news, when you see the world around you, what is it that raises that dissonance within your heart and strikes the chord of crying out to God? And if you can identify what that is, bring that to God in prayer. Because as we all see the many things of this world that are broken compared to the glory for which we wait, our prayers become the link between God's will and its accomplishment on the earth. And that may not happen in one prayer. It may not happen in one year or lifetime or generation. But I love what the great prayer warrior E.M. Bounds says when he says that prayers are deathless. Prayers outlive the lives of those who uttered them, outlive a generation, outlive an age, outlive a world. Why? Because the God who searches our hearts and knows the mind of the Spirit is using the groanings of all his people to work together for good. And I hope that you will remember that when you pray. If you're here this morning and you have yet to discover that relationship with God, the God who is not just that you perhaps are crying out to, but has called out to you, who throughout human history and as the purposes of the world have unfolded, has made his way and desires to write his name into your story and your name into his, so that you can be a part of the redemption story and the great promises of what is to come. And if you're here and in need of that or in need of the prayers of this family, however we can help, we hope that you'll come forward now as we stand and sing.